Good afternoon and good evening and good morning, everybody, wherever you may be. A very, very warm welcome to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this discussion of 10 years of conflict in Syria. I'm the permanent representative of Liechtenstein to the United Nations in New York. It's my pleasure and my honor to welcome everybody on behalf of all the co-sponsors to this event, with a very special thanks to my colleagues from Germany and from Qatar, who have been instrumental in putting this event together. The conflict in Syria is unique and stands out as far as human suffering, devastation, atrocity, crimes, and it has lasted as long as World War I and World War II together. At this point, we did commemorate the very sad occasion of the 10th anniversary on Monday, on the 15th of March. In thinking about this event, we wanted to do something that takes a comprehensive look at the conflict in all its aspects: humanitarian, economic, political, accountability, and we wanted to do so by giving a voice to civil society, international and of course in particular Syrian civil society. So this is the purpose of this event. I wanted to be as brief as possible, to have as much as time dedicated to the discussion among the panelists on this roundtable. And it's my great pleasure to hand over to Nicola Reindorp, the head of crisis action. Many thanks to you, Nicola, for doing this, and to your terrific team in helping set this up. Over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador Wenaweser. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, wherever you are, it's an honor to moderate this event to mark 10 years since Syrians took to the streets to protest against the abuses of their government, and their courage was met with force. I'm sure we're all keen to hear from our panelists and contributors today. It's a very rich lineup. But before we do, if I may, I'd like to just offer a few words of thanks on behalf of my colleagues and one personal reflection. So first, on behalf of my colleagues, let me say thank you to the missions of Liechtenstein, Germany and Qatar, and all today's co-hosts, many of whom have actively stood with Syrian civil society over the last 10 years against a backdrop of international failure. The number and range of co-hosts for this event, I think, is testament to the interest to listen to civil society perspectives on Syria's tragedy. Secondly, I have the honour not just to moderate today, but to lead crisis action that builds coalitions to protect people from war. My colleagues and I have been deeply privileged to work alongside courageous Syrians in pursuit of protection, peace and justice. Every Syrian we know has been affected by loss, displacement, detention, disappearance. And in the face of this, the resilience and optimism of Syrian civil society is awe-inspiring. I hope that we can honour our Syrian colleagues' determination that justice and peace for Syria will eventually be realised, that war crimes will not be overlooked, that impunity will not prevail. And finally, a personal reflection. I started my working life in the wake of the Rwandan genocide. I campaigned for the landmark agreement that sovereignty brings responsibility and that governments have a responsibility to protect their populations from genocide, the gravest crimes, genocide, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity and war crimes. An agreement that was passed in 2005 by the largest ever gathering of world leaders, with its implicit commitment of never again. Yet here we are, facing another historic international failure to protect. I think many of you listening will share my grief at that record. And I hope that we can renew our commitment and determination to make a reality of that 2005 landmark agreement that all states bear a responsibility to protect. Never again. But The purpose of today's event is not solely to lament international failures, though to learn lessons, it's important to mark the errors, and I think our panelists will do that. But this event is also to highlight how some governments and civil society have overcome the geopolitical obstacles to progress accountability, justice, and ensure humanitarian access, and to highlight the urgent tasks that are essential now to secure the rights and protection of Syrian civilians at this moment. We're going to have an event in 3 parts. First, we will hear remarks from 5 colleagues from civil society, to then be followed by reflections from Syrian civil society, and then contributions from member states, including some of the co-sponsors of today's event. We've asked colleagues to be succinct and to stick to their allotted time. I hope you'll all forgive me if I intervene to help us stick to this, but I'm feeling confident in you all that that won't be necessary. So now, to start our consideration of lessons and priorities, I'd like to turn first to Dr. Karam Shaar, widely published economist, non-resident scholar of the Middle East Institute in Washington, DC, who will reflect on the economic dimensions of the Syrian crisis. Karam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicola. Please just let me know if I'm talking more than needed. Basically, I first want to just comment on the word anniversary. I think for most of us, we tend to associate the word anniversary with positive things. I think that's because how we like to live. We like to remember good things and just ignore the sad events. Unfortunately, in Syria, that's not the case. The scale of the catastrophe is not something we can just forget. We can't ignore that. I want to basically talk about 4 things. The first is just a bit of a background, just give you a bit of a background on the economic root causes of the conflict, and then perhaps an economic assessment of the current situation. And then I'll just talk a little bit about the lessons and recommendations. And so basically, I think most of you agree that the root causes of the conflict were not necessarily economic, but that does not mean that there weren't many economic injustices. And here I mentioned 3. The first one is corruption. Syria, according to the Transparency International Index, was ranked 134 on their scale out of 178 or something. Nepotism. Rami Makhlouf, Bashar al-Assad's cousin, his web of companies was in control of so many sectors. People just hated him. They started shouting against him in the very early protests in various cities. And then finally, I want to talk about the unequal distribution of wealth. While Bashar al-Assad started liberalizing the economy, that meant that the overall level of income has actually increased. However, inequality was actually worsening in the first 10 years, so that gap between the have and have-nots. So from an economic perspective, I think these are some of the triggers. Now, if we look at a current economic assessment, I think this can be done in 2 ways. First, we can think of the macro economy just as a whole. I'll be very succinct. So basically, currently, Syria is producing overall GDP is somehow a third of what it used to be in 2010. The exchange rate, so the Syrian pound lost nearly 99% of its value against the US dollar, and 6 million people are in acute need for humanitarian assistance. So this is the big picture. But if we can look at what's happening regionally, I think you can split Syria into 4 different spheres of influence. The first is the regime where most people live currently. Almost 11 million people live there. And then the northeast, which living standards there are actually better than anywhere else, primarily because they have oil. And then the northwest, which can be also broken down into 2 regions. The first is areas under direct Turkish influence. Those areas are basically struggling to bring armed factions under control and to unite their visions for those regions. And HTS-held areas, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham held areas, where they're basically suffering the most, and the highest number of refugees is basically centered in those areas. So overall, I think if we focus on the lessons that we can learn. And I'll try to be very, very practical here. I think the first one is actually very obvious to you all. We needed much better coordination between member states. The fact that Syria was not rich, the fact that it was not as strategically important perhaps as maybe Iran or other countries, meant that countries were not genuinely interested in pushing for a political solution. What was being done is basically just saying, oh, what's happening in Syria is really sad. We have to do something. Come on, let's sit and talk. But no one was actually willing to make serious concessions to reach a genuine political settlement, or at least that's what I think. The second lesson, I think, is to other authoritarian regimes in the region. Don't be arrogant. Just don't be arrogant. This is against your own interest. What happened in Syria was Bashar al-Assad refused to budge from day one, giving any serious concession, which was basically against him. Why not compromise? The same thing happened in Morocco or in Jordan, or to a certain extent in Saudi Arabia. Why not compromise? Why not give people something, negotiate, be flexible? That will be better. That will make the country safer and will give the people something also to celebrate. Of course, that's incomplete. However, it's something. I think, looking forward, the economic recommendations, which is my last point, I have 3. The first is, I think the international community needs to push for better economic relations between these 4 spheres of influence that I talked about. I think we've tried to tell the Syrian regime to release prisoners. That didn't happen. Various other things have been tried. None of that happened. I think the first thing we should focus on for now is let these areas trade with one another. Let them benefit from each other. The Northeast has abundance of crude oil that they don't know how to refine, and regime-held areas, people are dying because it's very cold, because they don't have crude oil. However, they can refine all that additional oil. I think that's the first thing we should do. The second thing is to humanitarian agencies. We should stop focusing on short-term solutions. It's very obvious that this conflict is dragging on and on. We should stop giving people food to eat. We should give them opportunities. We should give them funding for small and medium projects. We should help them make something sustainable. The third one is we should put more pressure on Bashar al-Assad. The main obstacle to peace in Syria, and I think if you ask Bashar al-Assad, he will say he is the main obstacle, genuinely. The person who is preventing a solution in Syria is Bashar al-Assad. However, we should also understand that the current settings have meant that Bashar al-Assad's choice not to budge in any negotiations is perfectly rational. He's facing 2 choices. One of them is just much uglier than the other. The first one is the sanctions, which make him poorer. The second one is political settlement. He does not want a political settlement. He knows he will be ousted in a few months. He knows he might be taken to court later on. Given the current settings, I do not expect Bashar al-Assad to budge, and just keeping only the sanctions as the only tool of pressure, I think, is not enough. Something else needs to be done, and needs to be done quickly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karam. I have the pleasure now to invite Dima Moussa of the Syrian Opposition Coalition, founding member of the Syrian Women's Political Movement and member of the Syrian Constitutional Committee, to share her reflections, please, Dima, on the political dimensions of the crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola, and good afternoon or evening, everyone, depending on where you are. Well, the title is mainly civil society. As you notice, I'm on the political side, but really the two go hand in hand and complement one another. And while somewhat, I will say, will sound like reflections, these should be our guidelines in our work, whether political, civil society, or humanitarian, at the Syrian and international levels. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the member states sponsoring this event, mainly for keeping Syria and Syrians on the table and not letting them slip into the realm of the forgotten. At the same time, as a Syrian, it is painful to be here today commemorating a decade during which the Syrian people have experienced a multi-layered and multifaceted catastrophe that keeps on getting worse. 10 years ago, when Syrians took to the streets in a revolution that spread at one point to all major cities and many towns and villages in Syria, at its core, this was an expression of anger at the policies that had impoverished the majority of the population economically, socially, and politically. And this has cost Syria huge losses, and human losses remain the hardest to fathom and accept. The root causes of these losses and all aspects of the catastrophe today lie within the Syrian regime, because a closer look at Syria pre-revolution would reveal the existence of much of what we are witnessing now and have witnessed over the last 10 years. Today, it's critical to end the suffering of Syria and Syrians, and this can't happen unless we address the underlying roots of the problem. We as Syrians would have liked to be able to do this without more than half of the country destroyed, more than half of the population displaced, hundreds of thousands killed, missing, detained, or tortured, and more than 90% of the population today living under the poverty line. And more importantly, over 2 million children unenrolled in schools, with over 1 million others threatened therewith. The only way out is through a comprehensive political solution, a roadmap for which was drawn by the Geneva Communique of 2012, and later through Security Council Resolution 2254, which was adopted unanimously in December of 2015. We as opposition remain committed to the political solution through the full implementation of 2254, which outlines the steps of the political process, in addition to humanitarian aspects that are supposed to build trust between the Syrian sides and among Syrians themselves, in order to create the appropriate environment in which the political solution can be implemented and sustained. Today, that political process remains at a deadlock, and we have engaged positively in all attempts to get the political process moving, and have yet to find a serious partner on the other side of the table. This needs to change, because a comprehensive and sustainable political solution requires the engagement and will of all Syrians. However, this deadlock in the political process at the Syrian sides level also reflects a deadlock and a deep fissure at the international level with regards to the Syria dossier. I think that Syria has put to a true test the international community's commitment to empower the UN to achieve its central mission following the devastation of World War II, which is to maintain international peace and security. I am sad to say that we are witnessing today a failure of that test. However, there is hope, a glimpse of which we see through the efforts of some of the member states in supporting and enabling accountability initiatives, like the establishment of the IIIM and other actions at the UN level and at the national level where possible. This is very important, although it's not enough by itself, but it will contribute to Syria's recovery in the future, and it keeps alive within Syrians some faith in the UN and the international community, something that we can build on to restore Syrians' faith in the international community's commitment and ability to push forward the political process as the only way to achieve peace in Syria, which can't and will not be sustainable without justice. In a way, the important work on accountability is keeping the political process alive, but that can only work so much and so long. But it will also be a critical part of the comprehensive solution, as well as sending the message that there will be no impunity for crimes committed against the populations, a message that should be sent more strongly to the sides that are not engaging positively in the process. And here I mean, obviously, the Syrian regime. We're not talking, we don't want to forget the last 10 years, and we don't want to dwell on the mistakes. We need to look forward and truly commit to not meeting again in a year's time to repeat these reflections, but instead to do all that we can and we are capable of doing as Syrians, and more importantly, as the international community, so that when we meet next year, we are celebrating a new Syria and a restored faith in an international community, working together for peace and security in Syria and everywhere else. And for that, the international community really needs to step up its efforts in pushing for the political process by utilizing all the leverage it has to push the Syrian regime, to engage in the process more positively and effectively, and also by empowering the special envoy to Syria to be able to fulfill the mandate given to him by the Security Council. Thank you.
Dima, thank you very much indeed for those powerful words. Richard Gowan, I'd like to invite you, the UN Director at International Crisis Group and longtime UN analyst, for your perspectives.
Well, thank you, Nicola. Thank you, Christian, and thank you to all the co-organizers of this event to mark what is an exceptionally depressing anniversary. I mean, I think we can only begin by agreeing that Syria has been an appalling failure for the Security Council. And I suspect that historians of the UN, if anyone bothers to write about the UN, in 20 or 30 years' time, will put Syria on a par with the previous failures over Rwanda and over Bosnia. The tensions that Syria has created within the Security Council have clearly also contributed to the growing toxicity of relations amongst the P5. And so this is a conflict that has done great damage, as Dima said, to the United Nations. That said, I think the Council's approach to Syria is sometimes misunderstood. Commentators often simply say the Council has been paralyzed over the war. That isn't quite true, because throughout the last decade, many diplomats in the Council, often representing the elected members, have tried to push the body to at least do something to mitigate the conflict, for example, by authorizing humanitarian deliveries to rebel-held areas. And I think we should actually pay tribute now to many diplomats from countries such as Australia and Luxembourg, or more recently, Germany and Belgium, who have worked incredibly hard to use the Council as best they can to at least ease the suffering of the Syrians, even though P5 dynamics have repeatedly got in the way. Looking back, very simply, I think I would say that you can divide the history of Council engagement in Syria into two tracks: the conflict resolution track and the conflict regulation track. Now, the conflict resolution track has been a consistent failure, right from early efforts by Council members in 2011 to call for the end to rising violence, through the Annan mediation in 2012, and then into successive rounds of UN mediation. We've seen the Council divided, and as Karam, I think, rightly also said, many members of the Council really not throwing their weight behind a political solution to the war. Jean-Marie Guéhenno, who was Kofi Annan's deputy mediator in 2012, said that he felt that the P5 wanted to keep a mediation game going because it suited all their interests, but none of them really wanted to actually find the compromises necessary to end the conflict. And Annan's successor, Lakhdar Brahimi, and others have increasingly tried to keep the Council at arm's length and tended to work with Russia and the US in other formats away from New York. The Council has been marginalized on the politics. But the Council has played a marginally more positive role in terms of conflict regulation and conflict mitigation. That is, measures to ease the war in the absence of a resolution. We saw in 2013 the Council innovate quite remarkably to authorize the UN OPCW mission to get Assad's chemical arsenal dismantled. In 2014, we saw the Council authorize a unique cross-border aid mechanism to ensure that UN agencies could get supplies into rebel-held areas without the authorization of Damascus. And then in 2015, we saw further steps by the Council to try and monitor continuing chemical weapons use in Syria. Now, these are actually all significant innovations, and I do think that there have been some genuine efforts by Council members to try and ease the war, as I say. Sadly, I think we can see that there were significant gaps and significant failures in these efforts, And it's also always been clear that the Council is not going to take the lead on accountability. In 2014, Russia and China vetoed an ICC referral. Since then, Russia and China have also opposed the Council really engaging on human rights issues in Syria at all. Right now, sadly, I think we see even those small positive actions on conflict mitigation falling apart in the Council. The UN oversight of chemical issues came to an end in any serious sense a couple of years ago. Council debates about Syria are desultory and largely toxic. And Russia has, since 2019, been attempting to gradually dismantle the cross-border aid regime. And I fear that in July of this year, we'll probably see that cross-border aid regime come to an end. So I think the Council's role in Syria, deeply inglorious, is sadly becoming even less glorious. And it's hard to say what role the Council can have in future, unless there is some fundamental change in P5 dynamics around the conflict that would allow the Council to play a positive part in the reconstruction of Syria. But I'm afraid to say I held out relatively little hope for that.
Richard, thank you. Amanda Catanzano, the Senior Director for International Programs, Policy and Advocacy at the International Rescue Committee, to share insights from IRC's experience as a humanitarian organisation. Amanda, you have the floor.
Thank you to the mission of Liechtenstein and to all of today's co-sponsors. The IRC has been delivering life-saving humanitarian aid and services in Syria since 2012, but our work also spans the arc of the crisis. We support Syrian refugees in host communities in Lebanon and Jordan and Iraq, and along transit routes in Europe, and we resettle refugees in the United States. So across this arc, the Syrian conflict has spawned the greatest humanitarian crisis of our time, stressing the limits of diplomacy, of the global humanitarian system, and really of humanity itself. I think we can distill lessons, but we do so with humility, because for humanitarians, many of the key lessons are still among our biggest challenges. And I think I'll try to highlight 3 of them. First, as we mark the grim 10-year mark, we've learned that while this crisis is protracted, it's not static. Syrians are living with conflict's destructive legacy. Millions of Syrians live with disabilities and other physical and mental scars of war. Half of health facilities are offline, making common illness and injury life-threatening. And over 1/3 of schools are damaged or destroyed, threatening to leave a generation of children behind. But Syria is still an acute humanitarian emergency. Last year, we saw the largest wave of displacement since the conflict began. And IRC data reveals that 80% of displaced Syrians in the Northwest have been forced to flee at least 6 times, some as many as 25 times. And Syrians continue to confront new violence, shelling and intermittent airstrikes. And COVID-19 and a collapsing economy compound the conflict-driven misery. So Syrians are worse off today than at any point in the previous decade. 90% are living in poverty, 13 million are in need of humanitarian assistance, and a record 60% of the population is food insecure. Behind these huge numbers are real people, real parents forced to make unthinkable decisions to flee their homes with their children again, to send their children to work rather than to school, or to marry off their daughters. As long as this conflict continues, humanitarian needs will not wind down or even level off. So ensuring humanitarian assistance reaches Syrians is the minimum that we must do, which I think leads us to our second lesson, that the scale of the need demands the protection and expansion of humanitarian access. As Richard pointed out, in 2014, as needs spiraled, the Security Council acted with principle and pragmatism to authorize the cross-border delivery of aid, and it quickly became a lifeline. Last year, cross-border aid reached 2.4 million Syrians each month. Since 2014, humanitarian needs have jumped by 30%, making the humanitarian case for cross-border aid more valid than ever. But the humanitarian consensus at the Council has unraveled. The humanitarian space has become dangerously politicized, with aid being used as a bargaining chip. And last year, the Security Council twice, as Richard mentioned, reduced the scale of the cross-border mechanism so that today only 1 of the original 4 border crossing points remains. And this scale back in the absence of reliable alternatives is already undermining the humanitarian response. Aid workers had to respond to COVID-19 with shortages of PPE and testing kits. And today, our partners report chronic shortages in medications. Any further reduction would end the cross-border mechanism with life-threatening implications. Syrians deserve decisions based on realities on the ground, not political calculations and capitals. Political crises drive humanitarian needs, but humanitarian crises, insufficiently addressed, drive further instability, which leads to lesson number 3. What happens in Syria does not stay in Syria. Over 6 million people have fled beyond Syria's borders, and Syria remains unsafe for their return. Syria's neighbors have generously hosted refugees for 10 years, but they're buckling under the strain as they now confront COVID and their own economic crises. Yet the funding is plummeting. The regional humanitarian response was only 38% funded last year, its lowest level ever. At the Brussels conference, member states should recommit to supporting host countries and to helping refugees live more dignified lives and make truly voluntary decisions and choices about their future. And as I'm sure Bill will discuss, attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure have occurred with shocking impunity, and we risk this conflict setting a dangerous precedent in which Syria becomes the norm, not the exception, for conflict around the world. Multilateral diplomacy is necessary to increase the costs of violating international humanitarian law. To start, member states should strengthen existing accountability mechanisms and ensure adequate funding and staffing. Restoring that humanitarian consensus should be an urgent priority. To acknowledge Syrians' continued suffering and their right to our unconditional humanitarian support, to ensure unfettered access, to enhance accountability, and to show solidarity with the countries who will continue to host the lion's share of refugees. A failure to do so would have consequences far beyond Syria's borders. So again, I thank the co-hosts for bringing us together today and for your commitment to Syrians. And I'm looking forward to hearing what our next speaker has to say about accountability. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Amanda. And last but not least of our panelists in this part of today's events, Bill Wiley, founder and ED of the Commission for International Justice and Accountability, to draw on his deep experience in international criminal and international law. Bill.
Well, thank you very much to the organizers and Nicola for having me today. It's a real pleasure. And what I'd like to do is actually conclude briefly, necessarily, on in fact a positive note. Obviously, the criminal offenses continue to be perpetrated inside Syria, but that noted, we are starting to see the fact that justice is here, and we're going to have more and more justice coming for the Syrian people. I think most listeners will be aware of the recent conviction in a court in Koblenz, Germany, of Ayad al-Gharib for former security intelligence Syrian NCO for aiding and abetting crimes against humanity. This is of huge symbolic importance in the realm of justice, notwithstanding the fact that in the greater scheme of things, with respect to the Syrian state apparatus of repression, al-Gharib was, of course, a nobody, but his co-accused was not, and his co-accused, Anwar Raslan, will be convicted by the same court, assuredly, of much more serious offenses, I think, this autumn. It's clear in the public domain that Khalid al-Halabi, who's been resident and unfortunately unarrested in Vienna for a number of years now, former brigadier, head of state security in Raqqa Governorate. One assumes that the Austrian authorities will rally before too much longer and detain Mr. al-Halabi, or General al-Halabi, and he would be looking in that event at very, very serious charges. These and more prosecutions are coming and are possible because there's a tremendous amount of evidence available, really because of the work of Syrians, working, a great many working for our organization. We still have several dozen investigators deployed within Syria, obviously within ever-shrinking space, operational space. But only in December and January of this year, we removed another 300,000 pages of Syrian regime documentation from the battlefield. into a place of safety. And the total amount of, and here I speak only of Syrian regime documentation, the total amount of documentation held by our organization is 1.1 million pages of political, military, and security intelligence materials. And this is a gold mine, most especially when one is looking at bringing cases against high and higher level perpetrators who, and I've referenced the example of al-Halabi, but he's not the only one, but individuals are present in the West. There's high level or high value suspects that we're working now with domestic authorities in 13 states, principally in Western Europe, also North America and Australia, to bring to justice. And those national authorities are extremely well organized, particularly in states such as Germany, France, Northern European states, the Netherlands, and quite aggressive, if I could put it that way, in the pursuit of justice on behalf of the Syrian people within quite favorable domestic legal frameworks that they're working within. By way of example, by numbers, over the last 3 years, our organization has received 565 requests for assistance from law enforcement authorities in 13 states, involving roughly 2,200 suspects who are present from Syria, who are present in the West. About 60% of that number, 65% of that number are Syrian regime suspects, and the balance are Daesh or Islamic State suspects. So there are a lot of open active files at the moment, and we will see more and more arrests as time unfolds. Is the justice arrangement perfect? No, of course not. International criminal justice, in this case applied in the domestic domain, but also when it's applied by international courts and tribunals, is necessarily highly symbolic. That's why the case of the prosecution, successful prosecution of Al-Gharib is so very important. But what I'd like to close with is again, to reiterate that justice is here for the Syrian people. A great deal more criminal justice is coming for the Syrian people. And it's important, as regrettable as it is, that the international community, particularly focused on the UN Security Council, has not succeeded in establishing an international court or tribunal to deal with the Syria situation, or otherwise referring it to the International Criminal Court. That failure, if you will, is only means that we're missing one part of the puzzle. The other greater part of the puzzle, which is prosecutions and through domestic jurisdictions, that's working well, and it's going to continue to work well, and that much harder. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you to all of our panelists. We are now going to move to the roundtable portion of our event. I think our colleagues at the Qatar mission will work technological magic. And so we will now be bringing 6 of our colleagues from Syrian civil society to join, and then we will turn to hear from their perspectives on the panelists' comments. Tefessa, I'll just confirm that you're working your magic.
It seems working. We can open our mics and cameras here.
Great. Mohammed, so while we're just waiting for colleagues to come, I will just introduce the 6 colleagues that we have and then turn first to Farouk so that for our audience, we know who we will be hearing from. So we have with us, I hope, Farouk Habib, who is the Deputy General Manager for External Operations of the White Helmets. We have here Mohammed Al-Abdallah, Executive Director of the Syrian Justice and Accountability Center, that has been working hard to see that human rights violations in Syria are comprehensively documented and preserved for use. We have Hiba Al-Hamed from Moussa, which is the coalition of families of kidnapped persons with the Islamic State. I hope we have Ahmad Helmi, former detainee and manager of TAFI, an initiative that supports detention survivors. Karen Aboud, the Strategic Litigation Officer from the Syria Center for Media and Freedom of Expression, and Kenan Rahmani, the Senior Advocacy Advisor of the for the Syria campaign. So great to have you all. I'm going to ask you to keep your comments and reflections to 2 to 3 minutes. I will try not to interrupt, but may do that so that we stay on track. If I may, Farouk, would you like to offer your reflections on what you've heard, your perspective? Farouk, you'll just need to come off mute. Those wonderful words. I think you're nearly there. Tafessa, can we make sure that Farouk he's unmuted? Yeah. Great. Farouk, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Nicola, and thanks indeed for the mission of Qatar, Liechtenstein, and all ambassadors and representatives who co-hosted this event. This panel comes at the anniversary of the 10th anniversary of the Syrian uprising. And it's important that the space is kept for the Syrian civil society to speak and share messages, sorrows, and aspirations of the Syrian people. In the absence of having any legitimate government anywhere in Syria, and the lack of any efficient and functional public agencies in most of Syria, the Syrian civil society have stepped up, trying to fill the vacuum and offer alternatives to respond to the people's needs on the ground, protect their human rights, and to advocate for their cause anyway. From the people and to the people, the civil society actors, including the Syria Civil Defense, the White Helmets, the medical workers in health facilities and makeshift field hospitals, the media and human rights activists, the teachers, the lawyers, everyone from their position have been doing whatever possible, despite the extreme extraordinary challenges, doing almost everything, proving that the Syrian people can live, work, and survive without the ruthless regime and without the extremists. After 10 years of struggle and suffering, half of the Syrian people have been displaced internally or became refugees all over the world. More than 1 million people were killed or disappeared, and the vast majority of the infrastructure of our country have been destroyed. Yet the so-called international community has failed to support the Syrian people to have justice and to end this conflict. What did we learn? Looking at the address of this panel, key lessons learned and challenges. Of course, we can't discuss all lessons learned in a few minutes, but I invite you, all of you, to think thoroughly of one key lesson. Let's remember together, what did the murderers promise from the beginning, and look at where do the victims stand at present. While using horrific military force over the past years to invade the Syrian towns and villages, the thugs of Assad regime imposed collective punishment, besieged civilian areas, gassed women and children, and while doing so, they wrote on the walls of Daraa, Homs, Daraya, Madaya, Duma, they wrote two main slogans on the walls. First slogan was, Assad or we burn the country. They honored their promise on this one. And the second slogan was, starve or kneel. Here they failed because the Syrian people did not kneel. We suffered all kinds of pain, but we didn't kneel. And we don't stop our strive for justice and freedom. And at the same time, look on the other butcherer. What was the slogan of ISIS, for example? They said ISIS remaining and expanding. باقية وتتمدد. Where is it now? At the other side, look at the demonstrations in Syria early this week, in Idlib, and notably yesterday in Daraa. Look what happened. Look what did the people say on the ground. If you haven't seen them, please Google them. It was in Daraa, where the protests started 10 years ago. And now it's under control of the military of Assad regime and its allies. Thousands of civilians marched yesterday, shouting and dancing calling for freedom, justice, and accountability. The same slogans which the kids of Daraa wrote 10 years ago and the people of Daraa marched calling for. And at the same time, look at the demonstrations in Idlib this week, which is under HTS control. Thousands of Syrians, civilians, carrying the Syrian independence flag, which we call the flag of the Syrian revolution, but it's actually the flag of the Syrian independence state. And they also called for freedom, justice, and accountability in both Daraa and Idlib. And also look at the same time at the legal cases in Germany and in France, everywhere, which were submitted by the Syrian victims demanding to hold the Assad regime and all perpetrators of violations in Syria accountable for their crimes. So the key and simple lesson that the Syrian people will not stop its strive for justice. There is no military solution indeed. And all, sorry for this word, but all naive counts by some states on the regime itself to change or to stabilize the country are false. Any attempt to rehabilitate or normalize relations with this regime will not and cannot help to have any stability or sustainability. Accountability should come first, and there should be no more negotiations with this kind of killing machine on humanitarian access and cross-border humanitarian assistance.
Farouk, I'm going to ask you to come to the close so we have time for other colleagues.
Yeah, I'm finished. So this is my main message and the key lesson which I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Mohamed Al-Abdullah, your reflections.
Thank you very much for our host and for co-sponsors of this event. I want to talk about two subjects. I think they're very important to the Syrian people. One, in detention, disappearance, torture, and death under custody or in custody. This is clearly one of the most horrific violations Syrians have seen during the last 10 years of the conflict. However, the amount of reactions and the activity on this, it's great and strong from families, from survivors, from relatives of victims, was concluded with a great charter by 5 excellent victim groups. However, the reaction from the international community is quite lame into this, with all the respect due to everybody. I know the Caesar photos were a shock to all of us, but the reaction we got from the international community and the Caesar photos is really modest, let's say. It's still in Syria today, we don't have exact number of detainees. It's still in Syria, the whereabouts or the fate of a prisoner is just such information, just mere luxury for families. Like, we cannot have access to this type of information. And really here, we have 12 member states on this call sponsoring this event. We really want to advocate for a stand-alone UN Security Council resolution on the detainees and on the missing in Syria. We cannot continue with the issue of the missings and detainees unaddressed at the UN Security Council level. It's mentioned in the 2254, it's mentioned in different UN formats, but we need a standalone resolution. I know there's some reluctance from some member states, from France, I understand, because we don't want to see another Russian veto. But if Russia want to protect the killer more, let it be publicly, let it happen. Let's see them vetoing families and loved ones trying to find information about their missings. The other topic I want to talk about is also missings, but this time missings by ISIS, the ones who were left behind when the coalition bombed ISIS and destroyed ISIS and left the families without answers. We have families from those missings with us on the call, but I want to thank Germany and the US for supporting our effort in the search for the missing persons in Northeast Syria. When the international organizations actually didn't have the bravery and they didn't have the courage and they didn't have the stamina to go inside Syria and do this work, we acted. We brought the Argentinian forensic anthropology team, an internationally recognized entity doing forensic work, to provide capacity building for the first response team inside Syria. Of course, the trainings were slowed down by COVID and by the President Trump trying to withdraw from Northeast Syria. However, what we did is actually we suspended any further excavation of any graves just to ensure mass graves data is not being destroyed, and we're collecting evidence to the international standards that's needed. Just recently, I met with more than 70 families in Syria, between Arabs, Kurds, and between Deir ez-Zor and Raqqa, Arabs and Kurds, trying to explain to them the effort we're doing and the antemortem data we're trying to collect from the information. We have 2 or 3 concrete demands here, a lot of them with the US, but also from member states who joined the coalition against ISIS, which is basically interrogating ISIS fighters are held inside Syria. Nobody asked them about prisoners. Nobody asked them about missing. All the interrogations were about intelligence, about Baghdadi, about ISIS, but not about our loved ones. No, the US shipped lots of data, and Bill was talking about documents. The US shipped documents, laptops, hard drives, everything to the US. It never declassified any information and shared it with families and tried to go and find lists of. We extracted some documents from ISIS facilities. We managed to find lists of detainees and unfortunately some death sentences, verdicts on those documents. So we want to invite the US to start declassifying some of those information and the coalition against ISIS to prioritize the issue of missings and kidnapped that were left behind after the coalition defeated ISIS. Thank you very much all.
Mohammed, thank you very much. And this is, I think, a pertinent moment to move to Hiba Al-Hamed of Moussa. Your reflections, Hiba.
Thank you for organizing this event. I would like also to thank Mohammed because he highlighted the issue of detention by ISIS. As I personally concerned by this issue, my dad was kidnapped in Raqqa city in November 2013. So we as families, as Mohammed said, like we felt that we left alone, abandoned after the defeat of ISIS. We didn't have any answers for our questions. Neither the international coalition nor the de facto forces took any action in order to reveal the fates of our beloved ones. Mass graves were exhumed in unprofessional ways, without any legal framework, without any scientific standards. ISIS members were not at all investigated. They were either released by local reconciliations, either they joined the de facto forces, or they were delivered to Iraq, where they faced the death penalty, which means that we lost the source of information. So we as families, we feel that all what has been happening in northeastern Syria till today is doing nothing more than just the distortion of truth and justice. So I have some quick recommendations. Some of them were mentioned by Mohammed. I will not repeat them. But in general, we call to investigate ISIS members, but for the crimes that they committed against Syrians, not only for their belonging to ISIS. We call also on the suspending of the exhumations on the grounds. We need professional and independent exhumations, and we need families to be involved in any process, either in the process of investigation or in the process of exhumations. Families are key actors in this process, and without them, we can't reach anything. Also, I will call the states to recognize our demands in the Truth and Justice Charter, as Mohammed also mentioned it, because it provides a general vision of justice in Syria for the short and long term, and from victims' perspectives, those who are concerned by this issue. Also, at the end, we call on the states to ensure the de facto forces to stop release ISIS members or to deliver them to Iraq in order to face the death penalty, and at least to keep them right now, like just till we have real investigations with them. Thank you for listening.
Hiba, thank you very much for those really practical recommendations and that sense of, again, of how this touches you very personally and powerfully. Thanks. Ahmad, the manager of TAIFI, supporting detention survivors, you'd like to offer your reflections.
Thank you, Nicola, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for this important event. I'm Ahmed Helmi, founder and manager of TAIFI initiative to support survivors and victims of torture, and also a network of 120 Syrian survivors around the world. First, I want to reiterate both of Hiba and Mohammed's calls. They reflect what we truly do want. And second, allow me to borrow a word from some amazing Syrian woman called Fadwa Mahmoud. I think most of you have heard about her. She said that She was detained and forcibly disappeared and tortured by Assad father's the father regime. Her son is now forcibly disappeared and being tortured by Assad the son regime. And she is afraid, as long as we don't have justice and accountability, her grandchildren will be forcibly disappeared and detained. And that's what we don't want to see in the future. And since 2011, since we didn't see any progress on the international level, on the Security Council level, on the decision makers level, and every time we have a meeting, we advocate, we lobby, decision makers ask us what we can do. Therefore, we have prepared the Charter of Truth and Justice. It's a common vision of 5 key Syrian victim organizations on a roadmap toward justice and toward accountability. It's an answer of what we can do. And therefore, as families, we are moving beyond the slogans of release detainees. Now we are providing answers. And our answer now, what the Charter says, that justice for Syria is as we see it, as we preserve it, is a short-term and a long-term justice. The short-term justice is stated by immediate reveal of the fate and the whereabouts of the missing persons, immediate stop of the torture. And in the long term, we want to see accountability. We want to see changes in laws and practices. We want to see guarantees of non-reoccurrences. You can see our full vision for justice in the Charter, the Truth and Justice Charter. And for our first step, the first answer on what to do now, we want to see an independent mechanism works on revealing the fate. In the last month, we have seen UK, France, and Estonia joining the call from the recommendation from the COI, calling on an independent mechanism with an international mandate to coordinate and consolidate claims regarding missing person, including subjected to enforced disappearance, which also was highlighted by the working group for enforced disappearance by COI and by OHCHR representative last in 15th of March. Therefore, we are going to propose this mechanism in a newly and upcoming report, and we want the state support to achieve some sense of a short-term justice for the families. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abed, for that very clear request. Karam, from the Syrian Center for Media and Freedom of Expression.
Thank you for the organizing for making this happen. I'm gonna need 4 minutes. I prepared about 500 words. On this grim 10 years anniversary, gross human rights violations are still going on in Syria, and impunity seems to be the rule. For us, only transitional justice will allow Syrians to move on. Indeed, if justice mechanisms are not established, then millions of Syrians are thrown into bitterness, which can lead them to take justice into their own hands through extreme means such as vendetta or even turning into radicalism. Transitional justice is the only concept that will define responsibility and hold perpetrators accountable, and will lead to recognitions and reparation for victims, so that a healthy base is established for a possible peaceful and sustainable future in Syria. Justice is the concept that is independent from affiliation and shouldn't become a political tool so as to look for one perpetrator but turn a blind eye on another. We at SCM stand against all violation regardless of who the perpetrators are, and stand by all victims regardless of their orientation or affiliation. Transitional justice is what will allow and guarantee safe and voluntary return, since as of today, Syrians are not safe in Syria. Building a safe and livable Syria is not possible if rights and duties are not defined and if measures preventing atrocities are not taken and implemented. Earnest efforts by victims have led to the filing of complaints, such as one regarding chemical attacks. While these are important and essential, these are just the first steps toward transitional justice. We hope these complaints will not only determine responsibility and accountability, but will likewise push for global awakening. If the international community hadn't turned a blind eye on the first chemical attack in Syria, we would have never seen it repeated 197 more times inside Syria and against individuals in the UK. However, today, we have the chance to take strong actions. That is why it is important that more is done to sustain this accountability effort by expanding the possible and existing legal avenues in the Western world, such as with universal jurisdiction. This is why it is vital to enable victim witnesses and advocates by implementing more and effective protection for them to speak up. This is why presently states must strengthen their respective units fighting war crimes and crimes against humanity by investing in them with more financial and human resources. Fighting impunity is the duty and responsibility by every single person, not only because it's the morally right and the only sustainable solution, but also because it preserves the rest of the world. Today, if we don't put an end to what is going on in Syria, which country will be next? We are living in a connected world. Not stopping impunity in foreign frontiers is letting it propagate in our own lands. Finally, in 2021, no one can hide behind the excuse we didn't know. We do know, we have known for 10 long and agonizing years, and we are telling everyone again the time for a joint effective transitional justice is now. Thank you.
Karam, thank you very much for those very powerful words. And finally, briefly to Kenan Rahmani from the Syria campaign. Kenan.
Thank you, Nicola. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for allowing us to commemorate this 10th anniversary of the Syrian revolution. It's now been 10 years since the Syrian people inspired the whole world with their brave protests calling for freedom, dignity, and democracy. And it's been 10 years since the Assad regime, Russia, and Iran responded to those brave protesters with bullets, with siege, torture, chemical weapons, and everything that is imaginable to be used against them. And one would have hoped that in the past 10 years, the international community would have stood with the Syrian people who are calling for the same human rights that the UN has sworn to uphold, and would have stood against and stopped the brutal military machine of the Assad regime. But for 10 years, unfortunately, we've had only empty statements, more impunity, and unfortunately, a complete stalemate when it comes to the international community. Briefly, I'll just say that I hope that we do not have this cycle where every year we come back and commemorate another anniversary and Syrians ask for more to be done and nothing gets done. Now is the time to break the cycle. It's not too late to come to an end to this conflict. The most important thing is to ensure that the ceasefires remain in northeast and northwest Syria, and that we do not have major humanitarian crises as we've seen in years past. Addressing the humanitarian cross-border assistance is very important. And while we continue to push for a political solution, we cannot we have to keep our sights on the 100,000 or more Syrians who remain missing and detained to this day. There has to be a concerted push by the international community to ensure their release as quickly as possible, even while we work in parallel on a political solution along the guidelines of UNSCR 2254. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kenan. Colleagues, thank you very much indeed for sharing those important reflections. And we're now turning to hear views from member states. Again, I think, Tafessa, you may be doing some more technical wizardry. And I hope to be able to call first on His Excellency Christoph Hösgen, the permanent representative of the mission of Germany to the UN. Ambassador, you have the floor. You have the floor, but you don't yet have the microphone. We'll give that just a second. Ambassador Hösgen, I can see you there. You're currently muted. Tefesse, can you help where we have, I think at this moment, Ambassador Hoskan, are you there? It may be, Ambassador Hinton, we're coming to you, possibly as the first that I can see that is there. Just give for a few more seconds. So I think, if I may, I will turn to...
I think you can hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Ambassador, welcome. Please, you have the floor.
Well, thanks very much. Sorry for this. It's a bit too complicated for me. Thanks very much. I'm very happy to co-sponsor this event together with my friends Christian from Liechtenstein and Alia from Qatar, and listening to all the briefers here. This was very, very, very impressive. No. Talking as a German, we have been at the forefront of this crisis when it comes to picking up refugees. We have about 1 million Syrian refugees in Germany, and we host them, and we are convinced that this is something very important to do. We are the largest, or one of the largest donors of humanitarian aid. Many of you have also quoted the court case in Koblenz. So we have this universal jurisdiction in Germany, and we really believe, and many of the briefers today said how important it is that we propose and promote accountability. And then we have been in the Security Council for the last 2 years, and in the Security Council we have been not only being the pen holder for the humanitarian file, but also we have been very outspoken. And those of you who have followed this can testify that we were very clear in criticizing Syria, in criticizing also, and I come to that, others who are supporting it. Now, listening to all of you and then hearing it said, well, the international community has to act. Yes, the international community has to act, but we have to become more specific, because what we see very clearly is that when it comes to the international community, when it comes to the question, do we get a solution in the Security Council, you'll have the vast majority of countries in the Security Council in favor. The problem is, and I think at the very end, Kenan Rahmani mentioned it. I was a bit surprised not to hear a bit where the source. Of course, we know Assad. We know Assad and the root causes that brought in the policy continued. But Assad only can do what he does. He represents a minority of Syrians in the first place. He can do because he has protection, and he has protection by Iran. He has protection by Russia. And when it comes to the blockade in the Security Council, it is basically Russia. When you see who supports Assad, who supports Assad militarily. Some of you may have read the story about the Wagner group, Russian militias that have done incredible tortures on civilians there. When you see how Russia prevents accountability, how Russia is undermining OPCW and trying to also say that what happened there in terms of chemical weapons didn't happen, and it was the opposition, not Assad. A year and a half ago, you had this story, Pulitzer Prize winning story about the bombing by Russian planes of hospitals. So it's basically Russian, and only one of you, I think, all the briefers mentioned it. And I think this is where we saw that what President Biden has said about President Putin. I think we have to increase the price. We tried this very hard in the Security Council. We had our fights with the Russians and the Chinese, but I think we have to go beyond this. And I think if we want to have a political solution, the price for those who are against the political solution have to be increased. And I think also Russia has to made more accountability. Also, there was, of course, we have the special representative, Mr. Pelin. I think he tries everything on the political solution.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Hosken. And I don't in any way want to restrict member states laying out your views of what concretely needs to be done. If I may ask you all to be succinct so that we have time to speak, to hear from you. And if I may now turn to Her Excellency, Ambassador Al-Thani of Qatar.
Thank you very much, and many thanks to Ambassador Christian and to all the partners. Very much honored to be part of this event. Of course, it is unfortunate that we meet on the 10th anniversary of the Syrian revolution, which means more destruction and more catastrophe for the Syrian people because of this endless series of atrocities committed against the Syrian people. But just in the sake of time and not to repeat what have been said so far, I think the only point I wanted to focus on today, and that many of the briefers have done so today, which is focusing on accountability and reminding ourselves, of course, that together with more than 100 countries in 2016, when we came together and worked together towards the establishment of the IIIM on Syria, and of course, the mechanism today have shown success in documenting the most serious crimes, and we're really glad to hear the news that recently the mechanism have assisted in. We have learned that the mechanism have assisted 12 jurisdictions in prosecuting crimes committed in Syria. But yet again, it does not mean that we are yet there at the point where we are satisfied with the results we seek together on accountability in Syria. But again, as we reiterate the need for a political solution in Syria, as also Ambassador Christoph have mentioned, it should not be on the expense of not addressing the question of accountability. And yet again, accountability in Syria means sustaining peace in Syria. So it has to continue to be part of the solution for a sustained peace in Syria. So I will stop here.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Al-Thani. Ambassador Mills of the Permanent Mission of the US to the UN, you have the floor.
Thank you, Nicola. I appreciate it very much. Let me join others in thanking Liechtenstein and Qatar for organizing this event. The United States is very pleased to co-sponsor as well. Let me open by just saying, as always, my German colleague Christoph has spoken frankly and spoken truth to power to all of us here, and I certainly want to affirm my support for the remarks he's just made about the dynamics in the Council and who is enabling the Syrian regime to survive. Just to be quick, I thought I'd respond to some of the comments that were made in the very useful and practical briefings that I heard over the last hour. First, Dina's point, let me reiterate, the United States position remains unchanged. The only way to end the conflict is a political solution in accordance with Security Council Resolution 2254. And we have continuously called on the regime, and most importantly, its enabler in the Council, to stop obstructing the UN's efforts to advance the peace process in accordance with the resolution. I also wanted to flag the importance that we share on the IIM, the IIIM, in an effort to have accountability and to use that mechanism to collect evidence so that there can be long-term accountability for the crimes of the last 10 years. The United States argues hard for the continued viability of the IIM in the Council and to have it funded in the 5C committee in the UN. I appreciated Hiba and Mohammed's comments in particular about detainees. On the issue of detainees and missing persons, some of you may have heard Ambassador Thomas Greenfield, the Perm Rep for the United States, on Monday in the Council, where we highlighted this issue. And we pressed for the UN and for the Special Envoy to give detainees and their families higher attention and to reach out to the families in particular. The United States continues to fund UNITAD. Unfortunately, because of the security situation, most of its work is done in Iraq, not in Syria. But we stand ready to expand and fund UNITAD's efforts to exhume graves, account for the detainees, and we hope that it can expand its work to Syria soon. I would also say that there was mention of the cross-border humanitarian aid, and we share the concern of others, including Richard Gowan, that this doesn't look good. We will be pressing to maintain at least the one cross-border humanitarian crossing that's in place and that was authorized last year. When the renewal comes up before July, we will press the Council to consider additional crossing measures as needed. The COVID pandemic makes it even more clear. But we need civil society's help. We need civil society to be talking to the people on the Council who are against this. And we need your voices to be heard. So I would just make that appeal from our side. I'll just end by saying we, as a nation, the United States very much appreciates, welcomes the work of all the civil society groups that are active in Syria, especially those working on accountability and reconciliation and a political process forward. We don't want the regime's abuses, its horrible atrocities to be forgotten. And we don't want the Syrian people to endure another year of this. So we commend you all for the work you're doing. And a lot of the ideas I've heard, a lot of suggestions today, especially on detainees, I'll take back to Washington, and I appreciate people speaking frankly about what they would like to see. Thank you, Nicola.
Ambassador Mills, thanks very much for that. And I know colleagues will want to take you up on that offer of dialogue and further detail. If I may now, His Excellency, the Ambassador of the Netherlands, Ambassador Zenenrath, you have the floor.
Thank you, Nicola, and I'll be brief and thank all the excellent interventions that have been made already. I'll just make 3 points in reaction on accountability, on humanitarian aid, and the political process. And maybe to start off with accountability, I think all the speakers held up a mirror, and the mirror, what we see isn't pretty. I mean, it is true, we have failed the Syrian people over the last 10 years, and what we have seen is atrocious. So the only thing we can do, and what we must do, is make sure that it is not forgotten, that the evidence is retained, that it is retained in a manner in which it can be used in court. And we're doing that with the IIIM, and we are using it. And I think William made in that sense a hopeful remark. Koblenz was mentioned, other cases that we're seeing emerging worldwide, and we need to keep doing that. The perpetrators cannot escape justice, and we have the means. The ICC was also mentioned. It was blocked by Russia and China. But there's also the UN Convention Against Torture, and my country, and I know Canada joined in, we're holding Syria to account under this very specific UN convention. It can be done, it should be done, and I'm calling on all other countries to join that, because we have means and we should use them. On humanitarian, within Syria, the distribution of aid does not work. That is why we need cross-border. Cross-line aid does not work. It does not reach the people that need it, mostly in Idlib. So also there you will find us at your side, pressuring Russia, but also talking frankly to our UN partners on what is needed to get the aid where it's needed. And I certainly would hope that in the midst of this pandemic, we will at least reach an extension of the cross-border resolution. That is certainly my hope. We cannot fail the Syrian people more than we have already done so. And lastly, on the political process, let me be clear. The regime cannot expect to break society, break the country, break the economy, break the infrastructure, and have the international community pick up the bill for what they've destroyed without ensuring a political process in place that includes everyone. That is crystal clear. And that is the pressure that we need to keep pushing. That is the instrument that we still have and that we will keep using in order to force through a political solution, because that in the end is the only way in which we can come out of this quagmire and hopefully at a point in time start moving upwards, because that is what the Syrian people deserve. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the power and succinctness of those words, Ambassador. Now, Ambassador Hinton, the Deputy Permanent Representative of the Mission of Canada, you have the floor. You were offered it, you were taken away. It's now your moment. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nicola. Thanks for the field promotion here today as well, and to our Qatari host. I'm the acting Deputy Permanent Representative of Canada, but I will take it. Thanks to everyone for participating, and to my co-organizers and conveners today. Thanks to Ambassador Wenaweser for leading us off. This is critically important to hear from and engage with civil society, something that has been sorely missed here in New York, not only on this issue, but over the past year while we've been dealing with new methods of virtual work, new methods of limitations to accessing the UN campus, the General Assembly, and the Security Council. So more events like this, absolutely. One point off the top as well, similar to other sponsors of this event, my government, my country has relocated and resettled a considerable number of Syrians, particularly over the past 6 years since 2015. 73,000 Syrians have been identified, selected, processed, transported by my government to Canada. Now they are living across the country in 350 communities. And such an effort as that has touched everyone in our public service, including all of us in the foreign service. I served before New York in the region as our deputy ambassador in Tel Aviv, and was proud in that role to have facilitated some of that work, particularly the 2018 rescue of over 400 white helmets across the Golan, and then ultimately into Jordan, and eventually resettling many of those in Canada. It's heartwarming on one hand to have been directly part of such an effort, but tragic on the other to have only been able to reach a slim, small number of folks that are at risk from the Assad regime and its backers in Syria. I'll just point out that we agree entirely with a close partner of ours and a speaker earlier today, Mr. Habib. We appreciate that in this event, we're putting Syrian and civil society voices at the forefront. It's important for us all to hear from them. It's important to listen and hear from civil society on their own experiences, particularly the experience of the Syrians over the past 10 years. This is something we've pointed out in the GA most recently on the 2nd of March on the high-level panel on Syria. We need more of this, as I had said. It's essential as well if we truly want an inclusive and sustainable political solution to the conflict in line with 2254. It's also essential, as Amanda Catanzano outlined so comprehensively this afternoon, to meet the increasing humanitarian needs of Syrians throughout the country, including a renewal of 2533, the cross-border mechanism. It's also essential to ensure accountability for the atrocities committed by this regime and its backers over the past decade, including the use of chemical weapons against Syrian civilians, including indiscriminate attacks against civilian infrastructure, hospitals, schools, against children. Accountability for these crimes is critical to a lasting peace. It's why Canada, together with Netherlands, has formally requested negotiations with Syria to address Syrian human rights violations under the UN's Convention Against Torture. And lastly, Canada also supports the crucial work of the Commission of Inquiry, the IIIM. We welcome the recent publication of the Truth and Justice Charter, as highlighted earlier. And we encourage the international community to use the Charter as a guiding principle when addressing those issues. Thank you very much, Nicola, and thanks to colleagues here today.
Thank you so much. Excellencies, colleagues, I have 5 more speakers on the list. I know we are very keen to hear your views. If you can be very short, we're due to finish in 5 minutes. So if we can get there, if we have to overrun, but not by much, that would be great. I have the privilege now to ask for Ms. Elen Agladze, the Deputy Permanent Representative of Georgia to the UN, to take the floor. Do we have Ms. Agladze? Let me go then, we will see if we can find her. Ambassador Woodruff, you have the floor, the permanent mission of the UK to the UN.
Thank you very much, Nicola. I will. I had a lot to say, but I will not say it. So I will focus in my remarks because I'm conscious of the time. So I just want to say, of course, thank you, but more importantly, I think thank all of our civil society briefers this afternoon. It's been a very sobering reflection, I think, on the shocking toll that the last 10 years of conflict have taken on the Syrian people. And I think, as we've heard from them, the regime and its backers promote the idea that the conflict is over and encourage this normalization narrative. But all the while, they continue to commit just endless atrocities, oversee widespread corruption and mismanagement, and just wreck the economy. And that false narrative is such an insult to the suffering of the Syrian people. And it's, of course, simply not true. And it also fails completely to recognize that in order to move forward, the Syrian people will need to overcome both the challenges of the past, but also the challenges that they face day after day after day. I think what I do want to do is just very much endorse what others have said about humanitarian aid and about cross-border access and the need to push for greater aid access into Syria, but also for more sustainable long-term solutions to increase the resilience of millions living in conflict. And so, of course, the UK, of course, will continue to urge all fellow Security Council members, and some in particular, to recognise the UN's call for the retention of all modalities of aid delivery. And Richard talked about this earlier, as have others. As we approach the crucial negotiations in July, we will do everything we can to ensure that cross-border aid access is maintained so that those in need get it. This is critical. But as the permanent representative of Germany and others have pointed out, this is at risk. And we all know from whom. We need to be upfront about that. And we all know why. And we should be upfront about that as well. So I just want to conclude by just endorsing actually what Dima said earlier on. The UK, of course, remains fully committed to 2254 as the only clear path out of the conflict. Over the last 10 years, Assad's unrepentant, unreformed regime has consistently and deliberately undermined the pursuit of peace and caused untold suffering. If the regime and its backers want to avoid another 10 years of conflict, they must seriously engage with the political process as outlined in that resolution. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ambassador Woodruff. I'm delighted to see that we do now have Ms. Agladze. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Nicola, so much, and sorry for the technical glitch. I just wanted to briefly say how happy we are also to join the co-sponsors of this event, because 10 years into this harrowing conflict, I mean, there is a huge threat that we really get used to it and forget how hard this is. So just wanted to pay tribute to the civil society that has endured this conflict, this suffering for so long, too long. And we should mobilize as much as we can. And we as Georgia support all the accountability mechanisms, the IIIM, the Commission, the Special Envoy, but obviously we need to do more. And it was good to hear some of the progress on accountability from Wiley that's happening on the domestic front. We will continue to do that, and certainly Syrian people deserve much more from the international community. Thank you.
Thank you for those heartfelt words and succinctness too. If I may, our Italian colleague, Mr. Maurizio Antonini, the First Council of Political Coordinator of the Permanent Mission of Italy. You have the floor. Great. Yes.
Thank you, Nicola. First of all, let me thank the organizers for this most interesting event. I don't want to take too much of your time, as a lot has already been said by the panelists and the representatives of the civil society. I wish to thank them all for their insight. I had a long statement to make, but I'll cut down to the core of what I want to say, which is very much in line with my colleagues' previous statements. The world has been witnessing the horrors of the Syrian crisis for far too long. There's been war crimes and crimes against humanity, which have gone largely unaccounted. However, despite the challenges, the necessary steps to end the conflict are clear. There's a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process facilitated by the UN, in line with the criteria set out in Resolution 2254. Italian Foreign Minister Dima has already stated that at the UN that lasting peace in Syria and the peaceful return of refugees would be unattainable without a credible and inclusive political process. We will continue to support these efforts, Mr. Pedersen's efforts in creating a roadmap for progress and in accelerating the advancement of all of the pillars of Resolution 2254. And I very much agree with what has been said before on the upcoming presidential elections. They will hardly comply with the concept of freedom and fairness. They are not credible or inclusive, and therefore should not constitute the basis for legitimizing the Assad regime. There can be no normalization until a credible political transition is firmly underway. Also, in view of the Special Envoy Pedersen's recent briefing, we look forward to seeing a commitment from all stakeholders involved in the process to take strides in ultimately reaching our common goal of peace and stabilization for Syria. I leave you with the hope that the efforts led by the UN finally come to fruition and succeed in helping deliver peace for Syria. In this respect, unhindered humanitarian access and a positive outcome of the Brussels Donors Conference at the end of March are key factors. And I hope that we can, at least as a first step, move forward with Resolution 2254 and call for a ceasefire and political settlement in the country. Thank you, Nicola.
Thank you so much, Maurizio. And if I may, Mr. Tapio Pisalo, the Permanent Mission of Finland to the UN. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Nicola, and thank you very much to all our CSO participants for their statements. It's very good to hear from you, and you have a crucial role in the political process as well. So it's very important that you're here. It's a grim anniversary indeed. We've repeatedly witnessed grave violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. They're appalling and unacceptable. We call on all parties to the conflict to respect international humanitarian and human rights law. We have to end impunity for the most serious international crimes. Sustainable peace cannot be achieved without justice. Victims of international crimes need our solidarity. It's been a great disappointment that efforts to refer the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court have been vetoed in the Security Council. Finland has been a core supporter of the International Impartial Independent Mechanism for the Crimes Committed in Syria since its foundation. The work of the IIIM in bridging the gap between recent crimes and uncertain future prosecutions is crucial. We also welcome other accountability mechanisms, including the ongoing trials under the principle of universal jurisdiction mentioned by a few speakers here, that gives Syrians some justice. The dire humanitarian situation in Syria also calls for urgent and unimpeded flow of humanitarian aid. We call for the extension of vital cross-border humanitarian aid to Syria. And we, of course, support the Special Envoy Geir Pedersen in advancing a political solution in line with the UNSCR 2254. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And finally, can I call on Ms. Ashkaban Crabtree from the Permanent Mission of Turkey to the UN?
Thank you very much. I also salute everyone here for sake of keeping my words very short. I will focus on the humanitarian situation because I agree with everything that was mentioned by previous speakers on accountability and the political process. I also agree with everything that was said on humanitarian access, but I think as Turkey, we have a special role in this specific issue. I want to reflect on some of the things that were mentioned earlier. It was mentioned that Council has played a role and it can play a role again. It's a must that Council plays a role on this file. It has demonstrated in the past it can and it has to. There is no other choice. because as Ms. Catanzano has said, this increased humanitarian tragedy in Northwest will cause further instability. We have to think about the ramifications beyond the humanitarian realm as well. And again, going to your remarks, Nicola, we have a responsibility to protect. This also has something to do with all the lives that are at stake there. Also, this is the only way, the cross-border is the only way to reach COVID-19 PPPs and hopefully vaccination at some point. I also want to focus on the space, more space needed for civil society. Hearing from them directly, I think will help us solve this crisis maybe in a more accelerated manner. They play an important role both in political and justice and humanitarian spheres. As the protests in Daraa and Idlib have shown, Syrian people are showing resilience and their expectations are there to stay after 10 years. Their expectations from international community is to play our role, and that because they're not giving up on their hopes, neither can we. We must act now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those important remarks. Excellencies, colleagues, we are at the end of the presentations and reflections. Just very few words attempting to sum up a very rich and important discussion. I think a real appreciation from civil society for the co-sponsors for this event to give space to be able to air views, and an encouragement for more of this. Thank you. I think 5 key things. I think this very strong message that we've heard. It's not that the world doesn't know what has happened in Syria. It's perhaps one of the most well-documented conflicts, but it has been about a failure to act and the imperative to learn the lessons to apply elsewhere. I think at this moment, I think many of us will, Myanmar and Yemen as two other situations where we are watching still the possibility of escalation. We heard about the economic causes, corruption, nepotism, inequality, and a warning of what can come. And this very painful picture of what has happened around the dysfunction of the Security Council and how that has impeded action, with the demand that there needs to be an effort to increase the price of blocking inaction, and that member states need to continue to find ways to overcome the blockages in the council. That we heard, I think, nonetheless, I think that sense of when the international community has reacted, there has been a difference made. We heard that powerful message, the imperative of the political process. We have an agreed framework. This is the way out for Syrians, as we were told, and it needs to remain the common focus, and pressure needs to be brought to bear to fulfill 2254. Humanitarian access, at 2165, a huge breakthrough, but it has to remain in place. The risk for Syrians now, again, that stunning thing 10 years in, that there's actually still the levels of need and vulnerability now exacerbated by COVID. But of course, also the imperative of accountability, and where there has been important innovation and there is real sense of progress, there can be a time where justice will come. And I think that imperative that we have to honour, again, for me, that awe-inspiring resilience and belief of Syrian colleagues that they have shared here. And last, very much but not least, this sense the Security Council still can make inroads on detention and missing persons. And Hiba shared that sense of, for her own, so many people have lost members of their family, don't know where they are. So the imperative is growing support for an independent commission on the situation of all missing persons in Syria, and the recommendation that all member states throw their weight behind this recommendation. I think two things have struck out for me. I mean, Farouk, your comment, the importance of having a place to be able to share our sorrows, our challenges and our aspirations, and how important that is. The co-sponsors have offered that, so thank you. But also that imperative that this is a protracted crisis, but it's not a static one. In Amanda's words, the Syrians are dealing with the destructive legacy of this conflict on a daily basis, with its indignities and its horrors and its grief and its loss. Thank you all for your time and for your contribution, for the ingenuity and effort that you use of the positions that you have to try and make a difference and fulfill what I think is the aspiration of the responsibility to protect. Many thanks to you all. I think over and out.